All right, welcome. Hello, everyone, officially, and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on this, our first stop in the adult summer reading literary road trip. Tonight's event is part of Darien Library's beloved summer tradition, adult summer reading. If you haven't signed up for summer reading yet, what are you waiting for? All adults over the age of 18 are invited to participate, and this year's theme, of course, is literary road trip. How does it work? Well, you read or listen to great books over the summer. You tell us what you're reading and loving, and then you get entered into raffles to win fabulous prizes. You can pick up a game card here at the library, or you can visit the library's website at darienlibrary.org/summer reading. And tonight, every one of you attending this virtual event is automatically entered into our summer reading grand prize raffle, which will be pulled at the end of August. We're also going to be giving away several copies of Great Circle after tonight's event, and the winners of those giveaways will be emailed tomorrow morning. So look out for that and good luck. Finally, a special thank you to all of the friends of the Darien Library. It is your support that truly makes possible so much of what we do, our books, our materials, and all of our programming, including tonight's special event. And now, I am so thrilled to officially welcome to the Darien Library virtual stage, Maggie Shipstead, best-selling author of Seating Arrangements, Astonish Me, and her newest novel, Great Circle. Earlier this spring, our reader services team made a wish list of authors that they wanted as the featured summer reading author, and Maggie Shipstead was at the very top of that list. The team had received an advance reading copy of Great Circle, which got passed all around the library, including to me, and it immediately became an in-house favorite. The novel hits so perfectly on all of the themes represented in the literary road trip reading program: adventure, enrichment, and exploration. Great Circle is an epic work of historical fiction that spans well over a century. The main narrative centers on Marion Graves, a daring aviator whose adventurous spirit takes her from rural Montana to the sky-high battlefields over wartime London to the uncharted expanses of the Antarctic. Interspersed with Marion's story is that of Hadley Baxter, which is set in modern-day Los Angeles. Hadley is a Hollywood ingenue playing the role of Marion Graves in an Oscar bait biopic. But that is just scratching the surface of this intricately woven, gorgeously written novel that I personally could not put down. Maggie, welcome. We are so excited to have you, and we cannot wait to hear more.
Oh, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Excellent. And I heard you're going to start us off with just a brief excerpt, a reading from Great Circle.
Yeah, I'm just going to read from the very, very beginning, which is only a couple minutes, but this is from a logbook that's left behind in Antarctica by this pilot, Marion Graves, when she disappears and is rediscovered about 10 years later and then ultimately published as a book. Little America 3, Ross Ice Shelf, Antarctica, March 4th, 1950. I was born to be a wanderer. I was shaped to the earth like a seabird to a wave. Some birds fly until they die. I have made a promise to myself. My last descent won't be the tumbling, helpless kind, but a sharp gannet plunge, a dive with intent, aimed at something deep in the sea. I'm about to depart. I will try to pull the circle up from below, bringing the end to meet the beginning. I wish the line were a smooth meridian, a perfect taut hoop, but our course was distorted by necessity, the indifferent distribution of islands and airfields, the plane's need for fuel. I don't regret anything, but I will if I let myself. I can think only about the plane, the wind, and the shore so far away, where land begins again. The weather is improving. We fix the leak as best we can. I will go soon. I hate the never-ending day. The sun circles me like a vulture. I want a respite of stars. Circles are wondrous because they are endless. Anything endless is wondrous, but endlessness is torture too. I knew the horizon could never be caught, but still I chased it. What I have done is foolish. I had no choice but to do it. It isn't how I thought it would be now that the circle is almost closed, the beginning and end held apart by one last fearsome piece of water. I thought I would believe I'd seen the world, but there's too much of the world and too little of life. I thought I would believe I'd completed something, but now I doubt anything can be completed. I thought I would not be afraid. I thought I would become more than I am, but instead I know I am less than I thought. No one should ever read this. My life is my one possession, and yet, and yet, and yet.
I love that. Thank you so much. All right, so let's get into it. I have a few questions for you, and then we will open it up to you, our virtual audience. So think about your questions for Maggie. You can put them in the chat or the Q&A. So first, tell us about your own journey with this book. How long was the story and the characters living in your mind? When did you start writing it? How long did it take? And how different or similar was the process in Great Circle compared to your previous two novels?
Yeah, it took an eternity and it was extremely difficult. My first two novels, I wrote each of them in under a year. I wrote seating arrangements in about the first draft in about 8 months. And then there was, a year and a half of revision before I sold it. And Astonish Me was really fast. I wrote it from start to selling it to my publisher in 5 months. And so Astonish Me was published in 2014. And I kind of thought like, oh, that's how long it takes to write a book. I just bust them out and, send them out into the world. And I had the basic idea to write a book about a pilot in fall 2012. I saw a statue in Auckland of an aviatrix named Jean Batten, who was the first person to fly solo from the UK to New Zealand. And I just sort of thought, that'd be cool. I'll write a book about a pilot. And just because of my other books, I didn't start working for another really 2 years until fall of 2014, which is when I settled in LA. And so I never outline my books. I don't really have a plan. My other two books had started as short stories, so I at least had sort of like a voice and I had a couple plot points. I had something to aim for. And this was really just starting from nothing, although I knew I would have her fly in World War II transporting warplanes, which female pilots did both in the US and the UK. I just hadn't decided which one when I started. And so I just kind of dove in and just would have these sort of whims. I'd be like, now I'm going to incorporate a movie star. That happened pretty quickly, probably within a month of writing. I just had this really different voice that I wanted to use. And then that story sort of became a lens on some of the larger themes of the book. But when I was about 2 years into writing the first draft was when it dawned on me that I was in big trouble. And I'd written over 400 pages. So it was already longer than either of my other books. And I knew I wasn't halfway done. And I just had to sort of refocus and be like, I can do what I can do in any given day. I can't think about the whole. I just have to put my head down and sort of plod forward. And so it was another year and a half of work before I finished a complete draft, which was 980 manuscript pages.
Did you send 980 pages to your editor?
We actually sent and then my agent read it and I spent 9 months doing a revision, and then we sent my editor, we sold it on a partial that was 500 pages. And she was kind of like, how many more pages are there? And we were like, no, it doesn't matter. Like, it's not important.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah. And so then like in edits, and then it was 2 years and 8 months between selling it and publishing it. So like in the 7 years that it took, a big chunk of that was really sort of the publication or edits and all that stuff. But we trimmed about 25% of the length off it, mostly through small, pervasive cuts.
Wow. Are there things, I was going to ask this later, but were there things that you like were sad to let go, and that you're like, oh, maybe it might be, fuel for, I don't know, another novel or a short story or something, or were you?
I mean,
That just sounds painful.
Yeah, it was painful. And I did, a bit each draft. It would sort of lose 70 pages in a draft, and that wasn't enough, and lose 50 pages in the next draft. There were a couple things that were hard to let go of. I have throughout the book, there are these incomplete history sections. I'll sort of zoom through geological time and history. And I had one for Antarctica that was set, it was called An Incomplete History of Antarctica. That was very near the end of the book. It was right when Marion's doing her big flight around the world. And my editor was like, people at this point have read 540 pages. Like, nobody wants to go back to Pangea and like understand how Antarctica is separated from South America. Yeah, so that's the only one I was kind of sad about, although I completely agree with the decision. And then there are some things that were sort of challenging, like Marion's twin brother, Jamie, had this sort of plot line that was like one weird thing too many. He went to live in this religious community in Canada, which they're called the Doukhobors, and they're sort of like Russian Quakers. It's really, really interesting, and a real group of people. But my editor was like, this is just like, this book already has a lot going on. And so I had to sort of excise all of that, but then also write something to then connect the various pieces of his plotline. So it was also sort of, 2 steps forward, 1 step back as far as making it shorter.
It's fascinating. I can kind of see that for Jamie though.
Yeah, it was like, it was enough.
So Ron Charles, who's the book critic for Washington Post, had to say this, and I'm quoting from his review. So convincingly does Shipstead stitch her fictional heroine into the daring flight paths of early aviators that you'll be convinced that you remember the tragic day her plane disappeared. And this is absolutely true, because there was a point when I was reading your book that I Googled Marion Graves, because I thought, okay, I feel like this is I must have missed this history somewhere in my education. So tell us about the history in this work of what's mostly historical fiction. What was your research process like? Did you go to archives, primary sources? And I know that you work as a travel writer. So how did your travel writing assignments inform Great Circle?
Yeah, it was really catch as catch can. And you're definitely not alone Googling Marion. I think I've seen at some point I was looking for something, and it's like a suggested search on Google now, like Marion Graves pilot. Like everyone's like, she must be real. Um, yeah, so because I didn't have any sort of plan or plot outline, I just had to do my research as questions arose. And I really try hard not to have anachronisms, not to make assumptions, which just means, again, the whole thing is like swimming upstream, sort of go like, well, this is a house in Missoula, Montana in the late 20s. Like, would they have electricity? And the questions like that aren't necessarily easy to answer. And so you have to go find novels from that era and that setting and see if they had them. And so there's a lot of that. I sort of accumulated this eccentric library of reference novels because I'd be like, it'd be a great idea to start this book with a shipwreck. And then so now I have all these books about ocean liners and shipwrecks and trying to figure out how big the ship would be and how many people would be on it and how ships actually sink and this and that. I did, a lot of those books, there's some internet research. Same with Astonish Me, my previous book, I used a lot of videos, and they're sort of like instructional flying videos from World War II that are helpful. I did some primary source research. Marion, ultimately, I decided to make her fly in the Air Transport Auxiliary in the UK in World War II, which was men and women, starting from 1939, and 20-something American women went over to fly in it. And at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, they have the archives of some of these women. So I went up there for a few days and, rooted through these boxes of their stuff, and they've just hundreds of pages of sort of onion skin letters home to their parents, and that was incredibly helpful. But it was also like way too much to do in the time I had, so I was just taking pictures, and they had all these cool photos of these ladies in their sort of golden years having reunions, and many of them continue to have really adventurous lives. So yeah, it was never ending. I tried not to put things in the book just because I'd gone to the trouble of looking them up, which is always an impulse. And I tried not to get too bogged down, but it made it really slow.
That's fascinating. I just that being in that archive with all that onion skin sounds delightful. But research, it can be pleasurable, but I feel like there's also like the dark side, which is it could be such a rabbit hole where, as an author, you run the risk of getting so far deep, like you said, into the research that you sort of lose the thread or lose the clarity of your vision. So, I mean, was there a point at which you were like, okay, stop researching, I'm starting writing, or was it more like, as you're coming up across something, you would just, give yourself a time limit, or, how did you prevent the research aspect from becoming overwhelming to your process?
I think I was basically so impatient that was a little bit of a bulwark against it. Like I wanted to be able to move forward. Yeah, and the research too would drive the plot because it was such a blank. Like often I'd come across something, like I came across a PBS documentary called They Drew Fire, and it was about wartime artists and how each branch of the military recruited either from within or without their ranks artists during World War II and sort of said, go out and capture the spirit or essence of war. And so I can't remember what I was looking for when I found this, but I thought, oh, Jamie, because Jamie becomes an artist, I thought he could do this during the war. And so that, redirects the whole book. And that happened all the time, just things I came across. And I realized I forgot to answer the part of your question about the travel writing, which was that, yeah, I also started writing for travel magazines in the midst of this in like 2014, 2015. And when I started pitching stories, I was pitching places I wanted to go for the sake of the book. And so my first assignment that I pitched that went through was to the New Zealand sub-Antarctic. So between New Zealand and Antarctica, these islands, which do figure into the book. And yeah, I got to the Arctic a bunch of times, to Antarctica ultimately twice. One of my things was I wanted to, and then I would also happen to go places that I then put in the book. Like I happened to do a free sort of layover in the Cook Islands, and then the Cook Islands were close enough to the route I'd chosen for Marion that I could use it. I wanted to see the Antarctic interior, like even after I'd been to the edges on a ship, and it's really incredibly expensive to get there. And so what I ended up doing was I did a story for Outside about the Air National Guard unit that does our polar airlift, both in Antarctica and in the summer they go to Greenland. So I went with them to Greenland on one of their training flights and rode from upstate New York to Greenland in the back of a C-130 cargo plane. And then we were there for a few days and landed on the Greenland ice sheet, which looks exactly like the interior of Antarctica because it's just a huge uninterrupted, flat circle of white. And that was amazing. And it's such a simple image, but it also really informed my kind of understanding of these places and that visual in a way that was useful.
Absolutely. You capture it for someone who's never been to either place. I really did feel like I was there. It's breathtaking. Those passages in the book. Can you talk a little bit about the research or the experience you have about the technical aspects of the aviation and flying? I mean, it's so detailed and it feels so immediate, and you're there in the cockpit. I think one of our attendees, Monique said, I felt like I was with Marion when she was flying the airplane. Absolutely. You're in there with the cockpit, and it didn't overwhelm. Like there was a lot of technical detail, but it made sense, and you felt excited and you admired the intricacy of these beautiful machines, with her. Do you fly? Did you take lessons to prepare for this?
I don't fly, which in some ways I think maybe is helpful because I think I then have some idea what people who don't fly would find interesting and also need to know. I thought really hard about taking flying lessons kind of early on, and just ultimately I decided I didn't want to. And I think that people who fly feel really driven to do it. And it seemed like a sign not to do it that I didn't want to. And my brother just left the Air Force after 20 years, but he used to be a C-130 pilot, the same cargo plane I took to Greenland. And so he was a helpful resource. He helped me right at the beginning choose what kind of plane she would use and what route would make sense in that era. And then occasionally on some of the more technical flying sections, I would send them to him after I'd written them and be like, any red flags? Like, do you see any problems here? And yeah, most of it I did through books. Some more technical books, like there's a book called Stick and Rudder by Wolfgang Langewiesche, who's the father of the journalist William Langewiesche, who's probably the best working aviation journalist out there. He's incredible. And it sort of breaks down the principles of flying a really simple airplane, like a biplane. And so things like that were helpful. I did seek out, opportunities to fly in more unusual aircraft because of course on a commercial flight you're just looking out the side, and it's really important to be able to see out the front. So I did some flights where I landed on glaciers and planes was sitting next to the pilot. I rode in a glider. That was the only time I've ever turned an airplane that I was like, I don't like this. But yeah, kind of bit by bit, and just trying to sort of double check everything as much as possible. And oh, and my sort of the most fortuitous thing that happened was I was in Missoula, where Marion grows up and where a lot of the book is set. And I was at the little aviation museum, and I was sitting in the cockpit of a C-47, the kind of plane that Marion flies around the world. And these two guys were pushing a different little historical aircraft out. And they were like, tell that lady if she wants to come along, she can come along. And I was like, me? Like, I'm the lady? And so they were taking up a 1927 Travel Air 6000. And so that was the plane I ended up deciding to have Marion learn to fly, because I'd been in it just by total chance, and could, hear what it sounded like and what it smelled like, and go up in the exact place where she would have learned to fly and see what it looked like and take video. And so that was pretty amazing, pretty yeah, just really I don't know.
It's
Yeah,
like when the universe is
absolutely.
coming together, and it's like, you're on the right path here.
Yeah.
So I just need to read a little bit of this glowing Times review that Lynn Stager Strong wrote, because I think it captures the phenomenal thing that you did in this work. So she writes, within the first 60 pages of Shipstead's Great Circle, there are 2 plane crashes, the beginning of a Hollywood rendition of a plane crash, and a sunken ship. There's childhood abuse, adultery, and a presumed postpartum suicide. There's an orphaned 2-year-old and a father sent to Sing Sing. There's also a brush with death inside a car that's rusting in the middle of a rushing stream. And she goes on to talk about when she was in grad school for writing, her professor used to warn her against starting too high, because if you start your story here, that's where you have to stay, and that's a really hard thing to maintain in a work of fiction. But she talks about how over the next 500 odd pages, I felt the fear I feel when a student's work starts strong, when other novels open high, knowing that more often than not, lofty heights can't be sustained. But Great Circle starts high and maintains altitude. One might say it soars. So first of all, congratulations on that incredible New York Times review. But really, I think she's so right. You've got these multiple narrative threads, you've got alternating perspectives, you've got history, you've got a modern day story, you've got, dash of legend and folklore, the geological history of certain areas. I mean, there's a lot happening, and it could have, in less skillful hands, just been overwhelming, come crashing down. But you really do, as she said, maintain the altitude. So, I mean, how, and especially knowing that you don't outline, you kind of wing it. I'm just astonished. So how did you manage to keep all of those things aloft and it feel cohesive? It felt like a circle. It felt like something as a reader that you were being carried on this journey that felt plotted. It felt like it knew where it was going, and it felt purposeful, and it didn't come crashing down. So
Well, yeah, I mean, I was always afraid of that, like not knowing even how it would end throughout. I was just like, I hope this works. I haven't just invested, 4 years of my life and nothing. And that it was scary too. I don't really have readers along the way. So when my agent read it after 3 years and 3 months, that was my first reader. So, I mean, an element of it is just like blind faith or hope, I guess. I write in a writing application called Scrivener, which I'm always evangelizing for. And it's difficult to explain without being able to see it, but basically it lets me keep a lot of different documents in one place. So I could have a separate document for each chapter, but easily move between them and reorder them. So that helped me sort of have some sort of visual sense of the layout of the whole book and where things were connecting and sort of the balance between Hadley and Marion's sections. Although the structure of the book was readjusted many times, even up until the end. And when I sold the book, Marion's fight was broken into its pieces and arranged interstitially through the book, whereas now it's all in one piece at the end, which is my editor's suggestion, made it much better. But yeah, I kind of had to do it by feel. I think your subconscious does a lot of work that you aren't necessarily aware of all the time. Like often when I come to a problem late in a book, I'll find the solution early. And I think like there's some part of your brain that's keeping track of things and building off of what's actually there. But it's the whole thing's too big to really be conscious of at one time. So, I'd have to go back and reread what I'd written to sort of remind myself what I was doing. And every time I did that, I'd be like, oh yeah, here's like some forgotten thread I have to either make use of or get rid of or whatever. And for those who haven't read the book, I won't do any spoilers, but there was an early section called An Incomplete History of Sitting in the Water Grizzly, which is a figure from history I came across in my research and just found interesting and wrote this section, and then ultimately was able to use that much later in the book in a way that like wasn't even part of my plan. So it's also just, I think, a question of being like resourceful maybe with what you've already written.
I love that. And as a reader, it's so satisfying when those things happen, when like a little nugget from like earlier in the book winds up being like, you're like, oh, that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't just cool and interesting. It was like, oh, this is connecting in this narrative way. That's just such a satisfying feeling. Okay, one more questions for me, and then I see we have some great questions coming in from others. So there's this one passage and a particular line towards the end of the novel that is really was so moving to me and really stayed with me. And it's towards the end when Marion and her navigator Eddie are on their incredible flight path, and Eddie is doing what he does. He's measuring and plotting their course, and this is what you wrote. He pencils his neat log of figures, updating the distance they've covered, the time they will arrive. Distance equals speed multiplied by time. Time equals distance divided by speed. He feels the lines of latitude sliding underneath like rungs of a ladder, watches the whitecaps through the drift meter, measuring the difference between where they are going and where they mean to go. That's where life is, that wedge of discrepancy. I just love that. The difference between where we're going and where we mean to go, and that's where life is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, that's definitely from my experience. I think it's from a lot of people's experience, sort of have that element of surprise. Like I mean, even just writing this book changed my life in ways I didn't foresee. Like if I had just written the book in a year the way I thought, I would have gone back on book tour and then I would have written another book and like so on and so forth. But because I had to start traveling and learning more uh, about things that I used in the book. It got me into relationships I wouldn't have been in otherwise, and took me to parts of the world I wouldn't have seen, and it changed my attitude toward risk. I do a lot more sort of like adventure type travel now that has dramatically enriched my life, and I don't think would have happened if my plan for what this book would be had come true. And I mean, even the same with, I didn't really mean to be a writer. I just didn't know what to do after college. And so I went to grad school, and then it kind of kept working out. So, all of these things, I think, that's the sort of embracing the unexpected is something we all sort of have to do, whether we like it or not. I think we're sort of at the mercy of, that wedge of discrepancy.
That's certainly true. Let's see, we have some great questions. Let's see, Claire. Hi, Claire. Claire wants to know, well, she says, thank you, Maggie, for creating so many fascinating characters. Is there a character that you personally identify with and why?
That's why it's hard. I mean, I identify with the different characters in different ways. Like I think Hadley, the movie star, just being a modern person living in Los Angeles, I connect with on that level. And she has sort of this, the way I describe her voice as being sort of this acidic note that cuts through the book. And there's some of that in kind of my take on things or the way I am as a person. Marion's adventurousness was something that both, as I was just saying, sort of propelled my life, but also the more I did, the more I learned and took from other people I encountered that I could put into Marion. Jamie's sort of horror at violence and cruelty, I feel that as well. So, they're all me. They all come from my consciousness. So I both, I never feel like, I'm not a writer who sort of thinks, oh, I love my characters so much. I feel in a little bit of a sort of godlike coldness toward them at the same time.
Let's see. Pat wants to know, being a travel writer, what place around the world intrigues you the most?
Yeah, I really love the polar regions. I have been to Antarctica twice, to different sides, once to the Ross Sea, which is really, really, really remote, and really hard to get to. And then the other time to the Antarctica Peninsula, which is where everyone goes from South America. And I kind of had some attitude about the peninsula. I was like, it's not that far south, like, but so beautiful, so stunning. That was a cruise assignment for a magazine, and so I could bring my mom along, and it was just an amazing trip. But I like those really desolate, empty landscapes. I really like seeing wildlife, so I'm drawn to wildlife based trips. But there are plenty of places I haven't been that I'd like to go. I think Central Asia is pretty high on my list right now.
Nice. And you were saying before we went live that you're headed to Alaska, right? In a week or so?
Yeah, I'm going to Alaska on Saturday for Outside Magazine. Doing an all women's backcountry skills trip. So we'll take a bush plane into the mountains and hopefully not be eaten by bears, and it'll be good. Yeah.
Exciting. Let's see. Question from Casey, who wants to know what authors helped shape your writing?
Um, so many, and it's always changing. Like I never have sort of a favorite book or a favorite author. And I was an English major in college, so there's just a lot of writers kind of bouncing around in my head. But for this book, I mean, some of the books I drew from the most directly were other sort of long epic books often with some structural, just an unusual structure. So I talk a lot about Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. I really love that book, where the protagonist keeps dying and restarting, and at first it feels like a video game, but I think she does something really amazing with it. I loved Pachinko, All the Light We Cannot See, The Signature of All Things by Elizabeth Gilbert, a book I would sort of have on my desk and sometimes just kind of dip into. A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. Veronica by Mary Gateskill sort of informed Hadley's sections. So yeah, I kind of try to read a lot of different things, but I also read, mysteries and whatever. I read some nonfiction. Yeah, so a real mix.
I'm glad we're recording this because that was a great book list. um, let's see. There's a question from Marianne. Marianne wants to know, given that your characters are so well developed in the book, do you feel that you've said all that you wanted to about these people, or do you think there's another book where you might feature one of the more minor characters?
That's a really good question. And my thoughts on that have sort of evolved. I think the short answer is that I probably won't do that. I think, yeah, when I finish a book, I feel so deeply done. Like I could not read it again, especially a book this long, not only doing all the rounds of edits, but then reading it for copy edits and reading it twice for page proofs. I could not look at it again. But then, when I then had to sort of confront the blank page for the first time in more than 6 years and write something from scratch, I was reminded how difficult that is, and how daunting it is, and how all the time I was drafting this book, after day one, I was building on something. I wasn't starting from nothing. So, in some ways there's something appealing about the idea of taking a character that I already know, have already sort of familiarized myself with their world, make something else with it. I don't think I'll do it, but yeah, I got the same question sometimes about seating arrangements, my first book, or people would ask questions about like what happens to the characters after the book, but I never think outside the confines of the book. So I was like, I don't know.
Yeah, they live in our minds now, readers.
That's right. Yeah.
Let's see, Rick. Oh, that's a great question, Rick. Any interest from Hollywood for a movie adaptation, and who would be your picks to play Marion, Jamie, etc.?
I'm bad at the casting game. We are in the process of closing an option on it for a limited series for TV. So yeah, I mean, My other books, I think combined, have been optioned a total of 5 times. So I'm familiar with it, but neither of them have been made. So I'm very familiar with like the long and winding road from an option to production, especially something like this would be extremely expensive. Um, so I don't know, like it could happen, might not. With the casting, some of the actresses we've talked about for Marion are, and this is just total spitballing, so nobody tweet. Um, like Anya Taylor-Joy, Florence Pugh, somebody mentioned Emma Stone, Dakota Fanning. So lots of these sort of pale actresses. So I don't know. We'll see. And the other characters I have virtually no thoughts on.
All would be exciting. I would watch any of them. um, let's see. Congratulations on a fabulous book, says an anonymous attendee. How far in advance was your book chosen for Read with Jenna's book club?
5 months. Yeah, I knew about that for a long time. And you're sort of sworn to secrecy, so it's pretty pretty long lead up. But yeah, that was really cool. Although I was on the Today Show via Zoom, which was kind of a relief because I think I would have been very nervous to be live in the studio, which is what used to happen.
That's exciting. Let's see, Peter. Hey, Peter. Peter wants to know, did you manage to do any reading not connected with your novel writing during those 4 years? And what's the first book you did turn to after you completed this book?
Great question. Yeah, I did. I wouldn't say I read a lot during the years I was drafting. Much less than my sort of average. But yeah, here and there, and I would try purposefully to sort of read stuff that was unconnected. Like I remember
No
being
historical fiction when you're
right, or even just you have to be careful about verb tense. Like if I'm actually writing and I'm writing Marion sections which were in the past tense and I start reading something in the present tense, like I'll switch without realizing it and then you have to fix
wow.
it. It's a really strange like
Huh.
brain hiccup that happens to me really consistently. um yeah, I remember like being in Antarctica and reading The Boys in the Boat, the rowing historical nonfiction. um it's all kind of a blur otherwise. And then when I finished, I mean, during the pandemic, that was a big reading year for me. I think I read like 60
Wow.
books
Nice.
in 2020, something like that. I can't remember what the first one was though. It was probably, oh, it was kind of right around when I read Writers and Lovers, the Lily King book, and Monogamy by Sue Miller. I think those were both sort of last spring, and that was right when I was finishing up. And they both are kind of have some set in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I remember those two together. I really liked both.
Nice. Those are great. And 60, but I mean, that's great. I remember talking to a lot of people about how the pandemic, fog and emotional time actually was difficult for a lot of people to get into books and read. I feel like it was either one or the other. Either you escaped into a great book and a different world, or you just had trouble. trouble
Totally. And I
escape.
mean, yeah, I think everyone to writers is like, well, you have all this time at home. And it was not a productive writing time for me. But because I don't have another job, I had, quite a lot of free time. So I also watched a lot of TV.
Let's see. An anonymous attendee says, "How do you write the dual narratives? Did you write Marion first and then kind of layer Hadley in, or were they written sort of simultaneously?"
I wrote them simultaneously. I really, with the exception of Marion's Flight, which, as I mentioned, used to be sort of throughout and then got consolidated, really the order that the book falls in is how I wrote it. And I had to rearrange, I had to divvy up Hadley's sections in different ways, and I spaced them differently. I put them in different places, but the sort of sequence of them, I think, has always been the same. So sometimes it was a real relief if I've been writing Marion for a long time, just to write a shorter Hadley section that didn't require research. Could be a real sort of, yeah, just a break, a reset, palate cleanser. But yeah, it was a lot to sort of manage. And same with my second book, Astonish Me, also kind of has dual timelines. And I did it the same way. I would just write forward until I got sort of stuck or didn't want to keep writing in that timeline, and then I would change and then fill in sort of a blank from the past and move forward again. So it's challenging, and it definitely takes some adjusting as more and more of it accrues.
So fascinating. Laura wants to know, what are you reading now?
What am I reading now? I'm reading a upcoming book by a friend of mine, the thriller writer Chris Pavoni has a new book coming, and I'm gonna blurb it. So I'm reading that. I have what am I? Oh, I'm listening to a book called Last Call, which is nonfiction. It's sort of true crime and queer histories about a serial killer who was preying on gay men in New York City and thereabouts in the late 80s, early 90s, which is really well done. And I was also reading a book by Megan Abbott from a few years ago called You Will Know Me, I think. It was about gymnastics.
Nice. We're definitely going to put a book list together. Maggie's pick. Let's see. An anonymous attendee asked, have you listened to the audiobook of Great Circle yet?
I have not. I pretty much chose the actresses. We had a whole long process, kind of in consultation with the woman who produced it, and then the director. And as they were recording it, the director would get in touch about questions about pronunciation and things like that, and accents. But I haven't listened to it. I don't actually have it. I should probably buy it, but I'd be really curious. Although I've listened to both my other books on audio, and it was years later when I needed to reacquaint myself with the book for something. And so instead of subjecting myself to the like sometimes uncomfortable process of rereading it, I would listen to it. And that was also a fun way to hear the audiobook.
That's so interesting. Is that an odd experience to have that sort of come to life in that way?
Yeah, it is really weird. And I think like I thought all my readers have been great, but they are actors. And so they always elevate the pitch of scenes slightly above what I intended or the way I conceived of it. And so there's always like a little bit more drama to it. And that's always a little bit weird.
Oh, this is helpful. Someone just said you can download the audiobook from Overdrive. That must be a librarian. Thank you. Yes, you can.
I use the library app for LA, but I think there's quite a wait list. So
there probably is.
yeah.
Let's see. So you talked a lot about your process, but maybe are there any rituals? Like, do you have a writing ritual? Like you light a candle, or you like, do some yoga, or like what's your little process in terms of your rituals to prepare for writing or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, pre-pandemic, I would often go out just to a cafe in my neighborhood and get breakfast and get a giant latte. And it was kind of a bribe, it's like, you can go get coffee, but like you have to take your laptop and you have to sit there. And I really hadn't understood how helpful that was to me and how much I enjoyed it until I couldn't do it anymore. I really missed just sort of the stimulation of people being around and just getting out of the house. And when I was on the road places, I would sometimes try and replicate that. Like I taught in Tennessee for a semester, and I would go to coffee shops there. And when I was writing Astonish Me as well, I was in Paris for 3 of the 5 months I was writing it, and I would go to Starbucks, which like isn't very romantic, but they give you giant coffees and they have electrical outlets and you can stay for a long time. So that was always part of it. Obviously that wasn't possible. I do tend to work in the morning, not the early morning, but sort of pre-lunch. When I was younger, I would often work really late at night, and now I'm just like, no, thank you. Nothing can make me do that. And yeah, I don't know. I often have a book or two on my desk that I can kind of dip into and get a little momentum from. And like I said, I use Scrivener, but beyond that, it's just dogged persistence.
Do you set like word or page goals for yourself every day that you're trying to meet? Or
Sometimes I'll have periods where I do that if I'm feeling sort of mad at myself. And often I'll write past that. Like I might say 500 or 1,000 words a day, but if I have like productive days for me are over 2,000 words, I'm pretty, despite how long this book took, I'm pretty fast. And so I do that, but that can also be sort of frustrating if there's a day when I go back and reread the previous day's work and I cut a bunch of it, then I like create this deficit and it's hard to sort of, you know, kind of make all the math work all the time. So I'll do that for maybe a period of a few weeks and then it usually falls off.
Let's see, I think you might have mentioned that but maybe you can talk a little bit more about Sitting in the Water Grizzly. So that is a character that's based on historical folklore or legend or an actual historical
It
person.
was a real person, yeah. Sitting in the Water Grizzly was a native person who is what we would probably now call transgender, who was born a woman and married a member of the explorer David Thompson's retinue, and created all kinds of havoc. And they kicked her out, and she returned to her tribe. And when she returned to her tribe, she was like, "Oh, guess what? The white men turned me into a man." And so then started living as a man and took a wife and sold sort of prophecies amongst the tribes in Montana and what's now Montana and Idaho. And I came across him reading in my early Montana research somehow, and he sort of flits in and out of the journals of these explorers. So David Thompson talks about him, and John Franklin, who later famously disappeared in the Canadian Arctic, he's in John Franklin's journals and the journals of a Jesuit priest as well, and is really fascinating. Sort of the world of Native Americans often say two-spirited people, and all the sort of the huge spectrum of people in which who sort of fall under that umbrella, and also just the attitude of the explorers toward Sitting in the Water Grizzly was like, I think because the native people seemed so alien to them to begin with, there wasn't a lot of shock about this change in gender. It was like, weird. I guess that's something people do here, you know, and they sort of say like, oh, it's interesting that you know, this Boisvert's wife has returned and now she's a man. And so I was just really captivated by that. And Sitting in the Water Grizzly was also a translator amongst all the white people and the tribes, and seemed like someone who really lived in this sort of liminal way in more than one sense. And yeah, put him in the book, and then became sort of almost a theme in the book.
Can you actually, another an attendee asked, can you talk about the concept of a circle and how it played into the theme of the book? Kind of coming full circle with that in one sense.
Yeah. Yeah, this is my only book where I had the title from the beginning. My other books got titled much later, and everyone desperately wants to call it The Great Circle, and I've just given in, that's fine. But I didn't call it The Great Circle because I didn't want it to seem like it was literally about Marion's flight. It was more about the idea of the Great Circle. So yeah, just the how it explains this at the very beginning of the book, but a great circle is the circumference of a sphere at its fattest point. So the equator is one, but then all the lines of longitude are also great circles. And so the idea that the two poles are intersected by an infinite number of great circles, Marion's flight, and how sort of within our lives, like two different points might be connected by an infinite number of paths. So that was sort of what guided me. And then, yeah, there is a circularity to the structure of the book, particularly with, you know, Hadley. The book sort of starts at the end of Hadley's story and then reconnects later. So it was something that was in the back of my mind throughout, just sort of the geometry of it and also the metaphor of it.
It really does all come together so beautifully. We have several questions about what are you working on next, or are you just taking a breather, or do you have something percolating?
Yeah, I have a collection of short stories coming out next summer, which I sold with this book, and I should probably take a gander at sometime soon. Um, and then I had a few false starts with another novel, kind of in between doing copy edits and that sort of thing, that I abandoned for various reasons, and then sort of a few months less than that, maybe a couple months before I had to really sort of swing into gear for this book, I started what I think will stick, and my kind of starting question. I feel like my books always start from questions, not from like wanting to say something, but this question of what happens if two people who don't like each other get married and then stay married. And so I think it's going to be sort of a family drama, hope maybe a little bit of a saga. I can feel it starting to sprawl, but I'm going to try to contain it. I'd really prefer not to take another 7 years to write a book, but yeah.
Let's see. Someone wants to know, have you worked with the same editor for all your books?
Yeah, I have. I'm very fortunate to have done so. My editor's name is Jordan Pavlin, and she is an editor at Knopf. And yeah, she, um, when she read Seating Arrangements, I think that day she emailed my agent and was like, "Don't sell this book to anyone else. You know, you have to have it." And she's amazing. She is a really good editor for me, and she's just sort of radically open. Like if you look at all the books she edits, they're so different, and she just sort of takes everything as it comes and is really thoughtful about author's intentions and sees potential both in the way the author does and from the outside. So it's been a really good relationship, although we did this book just by virtue of being so long and so complex, it was a challenging editorial process at times.
Do you work because I imagine when you're on different, I'm imagining she's probably in New York, you're in LA. I mean, did you have a relationship where you were used to like Zooming or just on the phone or emailing, or was it hard to not get together in person and actually sit
Well,
around a table?
we've always done it where like a box shows up on my doorstep with the manuscript in it and has a cajillion post-it notes, each one marking a note of hers, and then like a 3-page single spaced size 8 font letter. And so that just arrives and I have to sort of absorb it and then get to work on it. And then I eventually send back another draft digitally. And then a couple months go by and then I get a box on my doorstep again. So it's this very sort of, analog process. There were a couple things that I would sort of email her about if I had a question or couldn't figure something out, but generally it's pretty removed, even though we have a great personal relationship, and like to hang out. But yeah, the actual editing is done as sort of turn-based system.
That's fascinating, but that's probably good. And then you have that separation and some time to like.
It can be helpful to have time to process. Yeah, when my agent read the first draft, she and I talked on the phone for something like 8 hours spread over 3 days. And that was really difficult. It's like a lot to sort of be like, okay, as we enter hour 7 of the conversation.
Let's see. I think we have a recommendation. Monique recommends West with the Night by Beryl Markham. So we have another book to add to our Maggie Plus reading list.
Yeah, great book, great classic flying book.
Anything else that that you wanted to share about the process of this book or any of the characters? Were there any bits of history that like you had talked about, like sometimes it's hard to let go, like I did all this research and I wish I could have included. Is there something that you still think about and that like lives in your head?
Ooh, yeah, I mean, there are a few things, like I mentioned the Dukabor plotline for Jamie. That was maybe something that fell into the category of I put it in because I'd bothered to learn about it. There's in the sort of incomplete history section, there's one that covers a lot of the history of aviation, and in some ways it's hard for me to remember what's actually in there and what was cut, but I used to have this really weird digression about the rediscovery of I think you say it's coelacanth. It's a fish with lobed fins, right? That was thought to be had been extinct for millions of years, and then in the late 30s, a fisherman in South Africa like dredged one up. And this biologist found it. This obviously has nothing to do with the book, but for some reason I came across it, and it used to be in there, and it was sort of simultaneous with the scientists like discovering nuclear fission, and everyone was just like, you can't have your prehistoric fish in the book. I'm sorry.
Do you have like a Rolodex, like a mental Rolodex of like one day when I have the opportunity to put that fish in a book, it's happening?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I also just tend to forget everything. Like as soon as I'm done, it just kind of all flushes out. So yeah, like I said, I have all these books in my office, and I'm just like, why do I have this book on like the battles of the Aleutian Islands in World War II? And like, I had a book on plate tectonics, and it can be hard to let go of, and all these airplane books, of course, but.
Right. Mary Ann wanted to know, she said she read an interview where you mentioned that you wanted to address the impossible questions of what is the magnitude of one life and what is the scale of one life versus the scale of the planet we live on. Can you talk a little bit about
Sure, yeah. I mean, this became sort of, I don't really think in terms of theme while I'm writing, but if I did think about a theme, what I did think about was scale. I think a friend asked me at some point, like, describe your book in one word, and I was like, scale. Um, yeah, just this question of, what is the size of a life? Every human life is sort of immense and also tiny. The planet is immense and it's tiny. How do you make sense of that? How do you incorporate that knowledge into your life? And Marion's kind of trying to see as much as she can see, but she knows it'll never be everything. It'll never be, in some sense, enough for her. And how do you make peace with that? And then it crept into the book in other ways, like Jamie, Marion's brother, when he's an artist, the sort of subject of his art, or what he's trying to do, is sort of make these paintings about the vastness and about the fact that you can't translate what you see, the way, even just like the shape of our visual field, you can't put that on a canvas. But how do you suggest that absence? And so that, I think, in a sort of meta way, became what the book was doing too. Like, this is a book that's about the vastness, and some of the stuff that's included that is sort of, some reviews are like, did this need to be this long? And it's like, no, it didn't. Of course not. Like, no, it didn't need to talk about, the glacial lake, Montana or Missoula and so on. But what I was trying to do in a way was show exactly how much sort of life and planet is surrounding this figure, this fictional character that I've built, and sort of slot her into an existing world. So yeah, that was something that really informed a lot of the book.
It's fascinating. And it does it. It feels big and vast, but also very intimate. And ending on a good note, Pat, who's head of our reader services department, said this morning a Darien Library patron saw our poster about tonight's event and was so excited because she said it's such a great book. And we have been getting so many great comments. I want to thank you for spending this evening with us, and thank all of you, our virtual audience, and our programming department and our reader services department, for putting together our fantastic summer reading road trip. This is our great start to our summer reading program. Maggie, thank you for spending the evening with us.
Oh, thanks, Kira. It was great chatting with you.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone. Reminder, if you haven't signed up for summer reading, do so. Come on into the library if you're local, and we'll give you a game card. You can win some amazing prizes, or you can visit us online. So even if you're not anywhere near Darien, Connecticut, you can still participate by going to darienlibrary.org/summer reading. And thank you, everyone. It was fabulous. This will be recorded and made available on our YouTube very shortly. Have a great night, everyone.